everybody to the webinar this morning. We know it's a difficult time of the year to find time to learn about Westside Fire because there's so many active Westside fires happening right now. But we appreciate all of you who could make it. And welcome. We hope it's a good discussion for everyone. My name is Autumn Ellison. I'm the program coordinator for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. The Northwest Fire Science Consortium is part of a national network. There are 15 different exchanges or consortiums. It is part of the Joint Fire Science Program, and the goal is to accelerate the awareness, understanding, and use of fire and fuel science. So in essence, we bring people together and we share knowledge around fire science. Some of the housekeeping rules today for the webinar: if you would like closed captions, I'm going to go ahead and enable those as soon as we get started here in a second. There should be a CC on your screen and you can get a chat transcript from there. The webinar is being recorded. We will make it publicly available on our YouTube channel, which is on the screen here, and we will also share it at the end in the chat so that you can watch it after or send it to folks who might be interested. So for today, for questions and discussion, it is our hope to have a really good discussion around the topics that are presented today after the results are gone over. And to do that, we have a Jamboard that we've started. And if folks aren't used to that, or if it's a new tool to them, there's some basic instructions. I will try and get out of my full screen here and show you what that looks like. Here is the Jamboard. Heidi and I will be continuing to put the links in the chat box to get over there. And it is our hope that you guys can use that. There's sticky notes in here. It's pretty basic. You can add thoughts, questions, and feedback with sticky notes. There's 5 slides. So up here is where you click forward to those. If you need more sticky notes, they are over here and you can drag them over. And it's pretty basic. So we hope that people will use that and we can visually see all of the feedback that we're gathering. In addition to that, if you're not comfortable going there, that's fine. You can use the chat box and the facilitators will make sure that things get incorporated to the Jamboard and that questions you have and posed there get incorporated into the discussion. At the end, if time allows, we will also allow for people to ask questions verbally if you prefer that. People can raise their hands and we can unmute you, and then you can ask them that way. So hopefully we hope to use all 3 of those. Finally, at the end, there is going to be a quick survey that pops up. It takes just a few minutes. All responses are anonymous. It's totally optional, but we do ask if you can take that. It really helps us with our programming, and it gives you the option to put your email down to get further updates on this project. And so I think that is about it for me. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenters today. We have Riva Denny and Alexandra Page Fisher, and they are both with the University of Michigan, the School of Environment and Sustainability. They are part of the Western Forest and Fire Initiative there, and they have been leading this project. We also have Heidi Huber-Stearns, who is going to help facilitate. She's also a part of this and will be facilitating the Jamboard and asking questions as we go along. So without further ado, I will hand the presentation over to our presenters. Thanks so much for being with us today, guys.
All right, so now Riva is going to share our presentation. Thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Paige Fisher. I go by my middle name, Paige. And I'm on the faculty at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. And I also head up an initiative here at University of Michigan on Western Forests and Fire. It's a group of interdisciplinary faculty and students and postdocs who are investigating fire and forests and communities in the West. And with me today is Riva Denny, an outgoing postdoctoral fellow at University of Michigan. So the purpose of this webinar is to share the very initial results from our study of family forest owners and on the west side of Oregon and Washington and their wildfire concerns and their management practices. Again, we acknowledge the timing isn't great. Many of the organizations and agencies we were targeting have a lot on their minds with the current fire and smoke conditions. But we will, of course, record and share the webinar, and we will also do another webinar report out on the final results of our study in about a year or so. What we're doing today is sharing the initial hot off the survey spreadsheet results. And our idea for this timing is that we wanted to share these data really early on in our analysis process. So going forward, we could make our efforts useful to organizations and agencies who are trying to support family forest owners. And we wanted to make sure we could share these data before we had a change in staff. So Riva Denny is headed out for a new job starting tomorrow. And so we wanted her to be available today while she could still field questions about the survey administration and kind of the variables and stuff. And that's because that's what she was responsible for. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge important organizations who have been involved in this study: the Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station, Westside Fire Research Initiative provided the funding for the study and is collaborating on the study design and will be collaborating on the analysis. Oregon State University Extension and Washington State University Extension collaborated on the design of the survey and the study and helped administer the survey. And then Oregon Department of Forestry, Washington DNR, OSWA, WFFA, and many other organizations provided general advice and suggestions, and we're very grateful for their involvement. So what I'm going to do is provide an overview, kind of an introduction to the study, some highlights, and then hand things over to Riva to walk us through the details. So our rationale, why is it that we took on this study? Well, personally, I've done a lot of work on family forest owners in the last 20 years, 15 years. I've done a lot of work on risk mitigation practices. So I'm really invested in this kind of field of research. But more importantly, we all know wildfire risk conditions are worsening in the Western Pacific Northwest. And we know this from a lot of scientific research studies, including those that project increasing fire probability, for example, as a result of fuel aridity across the West, but in ecoregions in Western Oregon and Washington. And family forest owners are exposed to this risk because of the extent of their holdings. They own approximately a quarter of the forest land in Western Oregon and Washington. And for that reason, they're arguably pretty sensitive to this risk because, they depend on these forests for their lifestyles, their livelihoods, home sites, timber, ranching income, long-term investments, amenities. So arguably, family forest owners could stand to benefit from reducing risk to reduce potential losses. And policy and programmatic initiatives recognize this and are targeting family forest owners with different policies and programs. So University Extension, state and federal natural resource agencies, OSWA, Washington Farm Forestry Association, private organizations like the American Forest Foundation, all these organizations are offering support to landowners through education and capacity building. And these policy and programmatic efforts would arguably benefit from a better understanding of family forest owners' motivations and capacities for reducing risk, because that's what they hinge their offerings on. So, that's kind of more on the applied side. On the scholarly level, we are academics. And in terms of, what's known out there, there are some pretty big gaps in our understanding of what compels people to engage in risk mitigation behavior and adaptation, like climate change adaptation behavior, especially under changing risk conditions and in the context of complexity, or complex risk conditions. And so the range of conditions in the Western Pacific Northwest, the fact that there are areas that experience fire infrequently and areas that experience fire frequently, and areas that historically did not experience a lot of fire, but now do, all of this creates kind of a unique situation where we have an opportunity to investigate some pretty interesting topics. So that's a little bit about kind of what motivated us in terms of our goals. They're threefold: provide baseline information about wildfire experiences, perceptions, management practices among Westside family forest owners, 2 is provide information to help with policy and programmatic efforts. And then 3 is to improve scientific understanding of risk mitigation and climate change adaptation, especially the influence of experience on people's behavior. And just like a little bit more about that last point, you know, some of the questions we're really interested in are, you know, how much do people's experiences with hazards and risks shape their perceptions of risk and compel them to change their behavior? Even when people perceive risk, will they try to do something to reduce it if they doubt their own abilities to make a difference? You know, the magnitude of the 2020 fires raised a lot of questions for people, like about their ability to manage fire risk in the face of such large fires. Do people even notice risk and hazard conditions when those changes are gradual? In some places, they're changing very gradually. What about when they're really sudden? How does that affect people's awareness? And then what does it take for people to change their behavior to reduce their vulnerability to risk? Are people mainly responding to recent experiences, or are they thinking out into the future? So those are some of the more kind of research questions that we'll be investigating into the future. So a little bit about our methods. So how we did this work, we used a survey. We sent out a survey to a random sample of 5,000 family forest owners in winter 2022. We started in February, late February. And we sent this survey out both with online and paper options to landowners across the regions in Western Oregon and Washington, and specifically with the idea that these regions had different wildfire risk conditions. And then in the survey, we asked questions and we asked people to refer to specific properties. So we knew kind of generally where those properties were, and so we knew about the fire and hazard conditions around them. And we also asked them to respond in reference to specific time periods, so we could kind of look back and reconstruct about recent and maybe not so recent behaviors. And we got 1,000 responses, so it's a 20% response rate. Definitely a lot of data. And so this map depicts, so just going back to that, yeah, the map depicts the 3 ecoregion groupings that we're going to be talking about today. Although we're going to be doing finer scale analysis in the future, today we're talking about 3 ecoregion groupings. At the bottom in yellow is the Klamath ecoregion. We're referring to CLAM as shorthand. And this is, you know, where frequent low and high intensity fires, some large, some small, have been historically characteristic. In blue, there are several other ecoregions kind of grouped together, where fires have historically been and continue to be less frequent and less severe as compared to CLAM. And then in green are the Willamette Valley and Western Cascades ecoregions, where large fires have historically been infrequent, but now are becoming more frequent, it seems. And as we know, you know, from the 2020 fires and this year's Cedar Fire. So that's a little bit about the methods. In the survey itself, we asked about, so these are the kinds of data we have that people might be interested in. We have data about people's wildfire experiences, different types of wildfire experiences, perceptions of risk, different ways that they're concerned, what different things that they're concerned about, their perceptions of their own capacity for responding, their own abilities, a wide variety of different management practices we asked about, information sources, where they get their information, how they use information, their climate change beliefs, as climate change is very relevant as a driver of wildfire risk in the Western PNW, and then of course demographics. So these are the kinds of data we have, and we'll be walking through some of this today. And then a little bit about who responded, just briefly. On average, 68 years old, more men than women. Majority have a bachelor's degree. Even more of a majority live on their property. The average size of the parcel that we asked people to refer to when they're responding to the survey was 64 acres, although they may have larger kind of overall ownership. And also that parcel size ranged up to 2,000 acres. And then in general, they had, or on average, they had owned their property for 26 years. So that's a little bit about who we're talking about. And I'm just going to give like a real quick overview of what we see as some of the highlights so far, and just looking at our data very descriptively. And so I'm going to mention these, and then I'll hand it over to Riva to walk us through how we kind of came to these conclusions. And again, just an initial overview is what we're doing here today, with the idea that we're making this information available to people who may be interested in specific analyses that we can do as we move along through our analysis process. So the first bullet here, unsurprisingly, there's been pretty similar levels of exposure to smoke and ash across these 3 ecoregion groupings. And, of course, that doesn't surprise us now because, we're seeing this a lot with our own eyes. More interesting is that that Klamath, the landowners in the Klamath and the Willamette Western Cascades ecoregions reported pretty similar levels of experience with fires, having them burn on nearby properties, having to evacuate as a result of fires, about a quarter in those areas. And I would say these similarities would have been kind of unexpected a few years ago before the 2020 fires. So another interesting thing is, despite these similar levels of experience, risk perception or concern remains higher in the Klamath ecoregion than the Western Cascades Willamette ecoregion, and we can kind of speculate why that is. We'll talk about that more. But so even though similar experiences are kind of the same, risk perception is different. And another thing that's interesting, I think it's not so much of a surprise to those of us who do research on family forest owners, but belief in climate change is high. And belief that climate change is a driver of wildfire risk is high among family forest owners across these regions. And then finally, with regard to management practices, almost half, kind of in the 40% of Klamath owners reported undertaking forest management practices to mitigate risk. But still, 1/5 to a quarter of owners in the Willamette and Western Cascades ecoregion also reported doing stuff. So that's more than we expected, and it's not all in response to the 2020 fires. So those are some highlights that we'll walk you through. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Riva.
Great, thanks, Paige. So I'm going to start by giving a little overview of some of the wildfire experiences that participants reported. So as Paige alluded to, smoke and ash experience is the most common, not surprisingly, but then highlighting the similar rates of experience in smoke and ash and evacuation in particular, but also not too much difference in wildfire burning on a neighboring property between the Klamath ecoregion and the Willamette and Western Cascades regions, and how similar those yellow and green bars are, on at least 2, if not 3 of those topics. And then, of course, the actual experience of a fire on their property still higher in the Klamath ecoregion, where that's more common, the chances are higher. So that's to get us started. And this is experience in the last 10 years. And so this is a snapshot to take an initial look at what those experience rates are like. And then moving on to their concerns about wildfires, we asked several different questions about this. And so starting off with the likelihood of wildfire, we had a set of questions asking participants to write in what they felt the chance was. So from a 0 to 100% chance of a wildfire happening in the next 10 years in a range of different contexts. And so one of the interesting things is that wildfire was perceived as a threat in all of the regions. So responses range from 0% to 100% in all 3 regions across all 3 of these questions. So we get the full range. Of course, the averages are not the same, but it was interesting to see that there were people that really thought there was a 100% chance that it was going to happen on their property or near their property in the next 5 years. So not surprisingly, the perceived chances are highest in the Klamath ecoregion and then lower in the Willamette and Western Cascades and the other. So even though experiences, at least in that first slide of results, where it's by those measures seems like pretty even rates of experience, the perceived chances are different across those regions. So that'll be something interesting to look into more in terms of what factors are related to higher or lower perceived likelihoods. We also asked them about their concerns stemming from a range of different types of events and conditions in their area. And I presented these broken into two groups: environmental sources of risk and human sources of risk. And the environmental sources were drought, extreme heat, changes in climate, and lightning. And then the human sources were accidental human ignitions, vegetation on and around the property, and prescribed burns getting out of control. And so, of course, concern was highest in the Klamath ecoregion and then lower in the other two. But overall, environmental sources were of greater concern than human sources in all three of those region areas, those ecoregion areas. And the list on the right here is in order of highest to lowest concern. So prescribed burns getting out of control was the lowest, had the lowest average concern of all of those, which I thought was interesting. So we also asked them about their perceptions of how wildfires in their area have changed. And so overall, owners think wildfires are getting worse across 4 measures. We asked them about frequency of fires, damage from fires, fire season, and size of fires. And the pattern across these 4 was very similar. So I'm just showing the frequency of fires in the graph here. But what's most interesting is that the Klamath ecoregion and Willamette and Western Cascades ecoregion owners certainly thought that fire was happening more frequently, as well as damage increasing in season and size that I'm not showing. But in these other ecoregions where fire is least common, we have the highest portion of respondents thinking that fire is unchanged. And it's a very similar proportion to those who are thinking that it's gotten worse. So overall, a very small portion of owners thought that it was getting less severe, but that share of folks who thought it hadn't changed was substantially larger in the low fire risk areas, or lower commonness of fire areas, which makes sense. We also asked them about their climate change beliefs and what they thought was contributing to climate change. So overall, the majority of owners believe that climate change is happening, and most also believe that it was human activities that are the main cause of climate change. But there was a lot, it's not so clear when it comes to the role of natural cycles in climate change. So I was really interested to see the even agreement, disagreement divide about the role of natural cycles. And so this is also suggesting that there are folks that think that human activities are the main cause and natural cycles are the main cause. So they think both of those are contributing. And there's really about a 20% difference there where that overlaps. So that even balance there is quite interesting. But the portion of people that thought were undecided about which one was the main cause stays consistent. And then thinking about climate change impacts, many owners do think that climate change is harming their forests, but there's also a large share that are uncertain about that or that disagree with that. But most owners do think that climate change is making wildfires worse. And that's much more consistent in the right side of that graph. So we've also asked about their forest management practices. And this graph is showing them ordered from most commonly used to least commonly used from left to right. And we asked them about the practices, both having done it in the last 10 years for any reason and also doing it because of wildfire concerns. So of course, it's a subset of those who do the practice that did it because of wildfire concerns. But what's really interesting when we look more closely at who did it because of wildfire concerns and look at that by the different ecoregions, we can see very clearly that the owners in the Klamath ecoregion were a lot more likely to have used the practice for or because of their wildfire concerns compared to the owners in the other regions. But we still have a good chunk of owners, especially in the Willamette and Western Cascades, who are reporting using them out of wildfire concern. And this holds true for the four practices on the right. The difference is not as dramatic in the way the graph shows it. But we do still see a pretty strong trend where the Klamath owners are the ones that are doing things most out of the wildfire concern. Did I skip one? No, there we go. We also had a question about collaboration for forest management. And this is showing the portion of respondents that reported collaborating with different other folks. And this included for planning the work, for paying for the work, and for doing the work. So this is across the capacity of the collaboration, or the form of the collaboration, and just looking at who they collaborated with most frequently. So not surprisingly, working with family members was the most common, followed by private contractors, public agencies, and then private consultants. And then to a lesser extent, other private forest owners, and then nonprofits at the low end. There are, of course, differences there depending on what type of collaboration there is, but this is just as a summary to get us started in terms of what kinds of things we found in relation to the questions that we had asked on the survey. And so this last section is looking at challenges and information sources. Oops. And so we asked about a range of management challenges. These are also ordered generally most greatest limitation on the left to least limitation on the right. But we see that these first 3 to 4 ones that are really about resources. So labor resources, money resources, knowledge and skill resources, time resources are fairly similar in the portions that reported being not a limitation, being a slight or moderate limitation, and being a significant or severe limitation. And it's not till we get over to the rules and regulations, cost share, and markets where we see a bigger portion that reported it not being a limitation. But I'm very curious how these may differ when we look more closely at individual contexts in terms of their distance to different places, the type of property they have. We might see more differences there if we were looking in a little bit more complex way. And then we asked also about the use of information sources and for different purposes. So the blue bars was use of the information source in the last 5 years in relation to general forest management information. The orange bars are for information about ways to manage wildfire risks. And then the gray ones are how forest conditions may be different in the future. And so for general forest management, natural resource or forestry agencies, other forest landowners, university extension, forestry consultants, and loggers or their contractors are the top sources. But when we're looking at wildfire risks, it's fire departments, then natural resource or forestry agencies are the top 2, followed by university extension. But then university extension is the top information source for how forest conditions may be different in the future. So depending on what kind of information, different information sources are particularly sought out. And then it was also apparent from this initial look at the data that owners in the Klamath ecoregion were seeking out information about wildfire risk specifically at higher rates than owners in the other regions. But they were also looking for information about wildfire risks. And so it was not a negligible portion in these lower wildfire occurrence areas. They are still looking for information about wildfire risk from one or more of the sources that were listed on the previous slide. All right, and now I'm going to pass it back to Paige for the wrap up. So thank you all for watching through these very preliminary results. It was really exciting to get to take a initial look at the survey data before I move on to my next position and start to see really think through what the possibilities are for future analyses and things that can be looked at in much more depth than we have here. This has really been the 10,000 foot overview of what we found with the survey.
Okay, yeah, so just to recap, again, kind of not surprising in light of the last couple years, but given the fact that we asked the question more in reference to the last 10 years, it was kind of interesting that Klamath and Willamette, Western Cascades landowners had reported similar near fire experiences. So having had a fire burn nearby or having to evacuate. And also interesting that despite these similar experiences, high risk perception was higher in the Klamath ecoregion as compared to the the Willamette Valley and Western Cascades. And that's probably because of that longer term legacy where Klamath owners generally just assume they're in a higher risk environment. This may be changing in the future in the Willamette Valley and Western Cascades ecoregion. Also super interesting about how high the levels are about belief in climate change as a driver of wildfire. I think that's going to be really helpful for communication. And also super interesting that, although Klamath owners are the most active wildfire risk mitigators in terms of their behavior, owners in these other regions are too, despite a much less fire historically in those areas. And also Klamath owners are most actively seeking out information, but again, others are too, at substantial kind of rates. The final point about labor, money, and time, well, that confirms kind of what we already know. It says that we probably have a pretty representative sample compared, or a sample that's similar compared to other studies, because these often turn out to be the biggest constraints. There's a lot more we can do with those data, but that's the highlight, I guess. So I do want to mention some potential limitations and kind of implications of the study. One thing that we're going to look at more, but just with any study, their biases, and you end up getting their biases in who responds. And so, given the high rates of wildfire concern and practice use, especially information seeking, it's possible that we have some response bias towards people who are already more concerned or already more engaged. And we'll be looking more at that, but and it's not like, that's not typical in survey research. And another thing to mention is just the recency of these 2020 fires. Originally, we were going to do this survey in the fall of 2020, and we changed course after September. But still, that's pretty recent. And although our questions generally prompted people to ask, to report their behaviors in a longer time period, so in the last 10 years or so, still the fact that those 2020 fires had happened makes it a little bit difficult for us to interpret kind of the change in behavior. It's unlikely that very many people who experienced the 2020 fires, or that a lot of people who had experienced the 2020 fires, were actively just really dramatically changing their management approach in the 1 year in between the time of those fires and the time they responded to the survey. But there's some complication there. But it also creates a really interesting opportunity. And we can look more at that by analyzing data about fire occurrence and severity in the areas in close proximity to the locations of the parcels to which the survey respondents were responding. So that's just another thing to mention. And then, just in terms of implications, I think there's a lot, of opportunity here. I mean, this is why we did the survey, because we thought there would be opportunity, but I think that just given the results, there's definitely some clear opportunities for how this information could inform different kinds of policy and programmatic efforts. Programmatic efforts mainly is what I'm thinking about. Adaptation planning in particular, especially as we're thinking about future climate change, future scenarios of wildfire risk under different climate change scenarios. There's a lot here for, planning about, especially in areas like the Willamette Valley and the Western Cascades, which are kind of facing novel fire scenarios or dramatic changes in fire scenarios. There's a lot here about communication, what people are capable of doing because they've demonstrated they do it, and what some of the factors might be in their decisions to do things. And then I think also for communication, there's not a lot of our communication efforts are based on research that have been done in areas where fire is frequent and severe. So now we have information about that could inform communication efforts in areas where fire, increased frequency and severity of fire is more recent. So that's just a few things to think about as we kind of think about the results. And then in terms of next steps, we're going to be following up with our partners, the organizations who were involved in the design and the administration of the survey are just now able to hear these results because they're just really hot out of the data analysis program. And so we're going to be following up with them about what other analyses we should be doing. We're going to be collaborating with the Forest Service on that analysis. We're going to be bringing on additional staff to replace REVA to be able to do analysis. And of course, we'll be working with different organizations and agencies and people who've been involved to draw out some of the implications for policies and programmatic initiatives. And we'll have more on that later. Here's some of our contact information. Heidi Huber-Stearns is involved in the Western Forest and Fire Initiative, and she's going to be doing a lot of facilitating our kind of engaged research and how we make sure our research is useful and relevant and responsive. And so she's a good contact person for following up on these data. And of course, I am ready and willing to respond as well. And then here's a link to our website. So with that, I think we're ready for questions.
Yeah, we're gonna turn it over to Heidi to go over some of the great feedback that's been put in the Jamboard. Heidi, would you like me to share that screen for the Jamboard now, or should we wait?
Let's wait in case Reva needs to go back to any of the slides. But if folks are looking for it, I'm compiling the questions and other people have put them on slide 2 of the Jamboard. Also, feel free to stick them in the chat and we'll monitor that as well. And as Autumn mentioned, you can raise your hand. And so we're hoping to talk about 2 things. First, to just do some clarifying questions and kind of immediate questions about the presentation itself, and then hopefully having some broader discussion around how you could see this being useful for your work, what you would want to see more of, things like that. So feel free to use slides 2 and 3 of the Jamboard for that, or chime in here. But just to start, Paige and Reva, one of the questions that a couple people flagged was, what methods did you use to identify and outreach to the FFOs to engage them in the survey? So what methods did you use and what outreach did you use for identifying those landowners?
Yep, so we used tax lot data in terms of who are landowners in those areas. And we had to take different approaches for Oregon and Washington in terms of how we got to that point, but the process was generally similar. So having the tax lot information, and these were as GIS spatial files, as shape files. And so we used a combination of forest masks to narrow down that area to forested properties. And then we did, for Oregon in particular, we filtered by owner name to try to just narrow it down to owners that were likely family forest owners. And then we had a filtering question on the survey to make sure that that's who we were reaching, were individual private owners. And then for Washington, we were able to work with the group there to get data for Washington that was already specific to family forest owners. And so we had what amounted to a very long list of all of the potentially eligible family forest owners in those 2 states. And then we randomly selected owners from that list. And then if they had multiple properties, we randomly selected one of those properties to ask about. So that was how we came up with who was in our sample. And then we mailed them a letter and a postcard inviting them to take the survey online. And then we followed up with a paper survey and another reminder postcard. And so as Paige mentioned, we had about half of people respond online and about half respond by paper. So hopefully that covers those general questions. But if there are more questions, I'm happy to fill in more detail.
Perfect. Thanks, Riva. If there are other questions, please post them in the chat about the methods and we can follow up with you. Another question is about if you asked respondents about their perceptions regarding local, state, and federal forest management regarding fire mitigation, and if so, what that looked like. I can repeat it one more time.
I think I got it. So we didn't have a question that was that specific, though we did have some comments on that topic that people volunteered, but we did not have a question that was set up quite like that.
And the comments so far, you haven't coded or gone through in detail, have you?
No,
okay.
No, not systematically.
Okay, so there's some writing comments that aren't being reflected here in what you presented so far. Great.
Correct.
And so then another question is, a couple people are interested in knowing if responses to risk differed between those who live on their properties and those who might be absentee landowners.
That's a great question. That's not something that we've looked at yet, but would definitely be on the list.
But that's something you could look at.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
We have that information to do that.
Great. Another question, with over 50% collaborating with family to manage forests, are they using their own funds to pay for activities, or are they receiving some sort of cost share?
We would be able to look into that based on how we set up the question, but that's not reflected in what I showed. I think we have a slide with a little bit more breakdown, if I can find it.
Yeah, we asked people.
Or I didn't put it in, sorry.
Yeah, we asked people to indicate whether they planned, paid for, or implemented different kind like management with these other entities. And so we can look at for each entity, so family members, natural resource agencies, neighbors, we can determine, the rate at which people do those 3 things: plan, pay for, implement.
Yeah, so we'll be able to get to some of that. I think that the doing was the highest one with family.
Great, thanks. Another question is about fire severity is higher in plantations. What do you recommend private owners do to collectively reduce fire severity?
Yeah, I mean, some we don't know the extent of plantation style and management on the properties of our survey respondents. I mean, we might be able to find that out. So we don't really know, so we can't really interpret at this point their management or predictors of their management using that variable. So as of right now, and then in terms of what they should do. So I would defer to like Extension and our natural resource agencies who, already know how to advise landowners on different kinds of management practices for reducing risk in different kinds of conditions, not being a forester myself.
Thanks. And then I've noticed a couple questions related to prescribed fire. One in particular is, did you happen to ask about barriers to management of private lands, particularly the use of prescribed fire?
I don't think that we had a barrier question that was specific, or like a challenges question that was specific to prescribed fire. We asked about if they had used it in the past or planned to use it, and whether that was for any management reason or for wildfire concerns specifically. But we don't have we didn't have a question that was barriers to specific practices.
Although we did ask about their perception of risks associated with being held liable for wildfire spreading off the property. And that's because we consider that, you know, not only an aspect of people's risk perceptions, you know, but a concern in terms of, you know, barriers.
So I'm going to transition us to some maybe broader questions, and just flagging for everyone that we will send, when we send out a follow-up from the webinar, we will answer any questions that we don't get to that have been posed here that we haven't answered during this time. So apparently the winning question today is, how can this research about forest owners of this area perceive, sorry, let me try that again. How can this information about how those forest owners perceive current and future wildfire related risks be used to tailor outreach efforts to different landowners? That got the most stars, so I guess we're going to call that the winning question. And I think that opens up this broader discussion, aligns with some of the goals of this project, and would love to hear your thoughts from both of you about that.
You want to start, Paige?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm thinking like, okay, so how can we use the information about how landowners perceive wildfire risk? I mean, I think that just recognizing the level of concern, using across, you know, using the multiple questions that, you know, that we use to get at that, among, you know, in the Willamette Valley and Western Cascades and the other kind of historically non-fire prone ecoregions. I mean, what that suggests is that, you know, people are concerned, even if they haven't experienced it directly, you know, as is the case in those other more kind of moist forest areas. And even in the Willamette Valley, where a minority experienced it, but they definitely had a wake-up call. You know, there's definitely kind of a substantial level of concern and interest, which means that there's a receptive, you know, a certain proportion of the population in those areas is receptive to communication. I don't know if I hope I got that whole question.
Well, I think too that if, you know, we have a better understanding of what particular things they're concerned about, and so outreach can use that as the point of contact to have larger conversations with them. So even if what they're most concerned about may not necessarily be what is the highest risk, but if that can be used to get their attention and build lines of communication, then that's going to be valuable to know, so that those messages can be set up to be, you know, at the very least compatible with their concerns, and then be able to be broadened as needed.
Great.
And the fact that people are expecting across these eco-region groupings that we use today, the fact that people are expecting that wildfires are occurring and becoming more occurring more frequently, becoming more damaging, the seasons are longer, the sizes are bigger. There's a general, you know, kind of high level of, you know, concern about the future of wildfire risk.
Thanks, Paige. Thanks, Riva. So recognizing that there's a couple things we're not getting to here, but being sensitive to time, Autumn, could you switch us to slide 3, please, of the Jamboard? And like to spend a couple minutes on getting people's thoughts and reactions to both this idea of like what could you do with this information in your work? And then also, you know, kind of the nuts and bolts questions of like what types of information are most useful to you. So feel free to drop stars on some of those things on the side, share other formats of information. But just reading a couple of those comments about how could you use this information in your work. We see a couple people starring that this could help them understand how to help landowners develop their priorities for treatments and develop specific prescriptions for treatments. And then another comment is around your results mirror much of what we're finding in California from interviews with our forest stewardship participants. And if anyone on the call wants to raise their hand and expand on any of those comments, please feel free to do so. Autumn's looking for hands raised. And then another, oh, sorry.
I was noting that there were multiple stars on that blue
Yes.
sticky note. And it seems like a good time to mention that we had some questions on the survey, specifically to work with Jeremy Freed at the Pacific Northwest Research Station, related to more landscape scale effects of different forest management practices. So that's going to be a little while in coming until those results are ready to share. But I think that is going to at least partially speak to that question on the blue sticky, in terms of what kinds of practices are going to be effective in helping either worsen or reduce wildfire risk broadly, and kind of how many owners and what kind of areas would need to be participating to have an effect. Those are the types of questions that he's going to be able to understand better, what the range of different practices are and what those effects are going to be over time and over larger areas. So that, of course, is larger scale, but it requires many people to do those at smaller scales for that to actually happen. So the people that found that sticky interesting, there'll be more in that direction coming along later.
Great, thanks, Riva. And I think one thing I wanted to flag is if people are interested in joining our contact list for future discussion, other workshopping ideas, whatever we're doing in this space with these data, or at least getting some of the results from this, please feel free to reach out to me or to Paige, or to share your email address at the end of the webinar, so we can make sure we capture that and add it to our list. Another comment here, just maybe as a kind of a wrap-up point, is, well, two. One is that it's helpful to see the stars on what types of information are useful for you. That's really helpful for us to get a sense of, so thank you. And then kind of a statement question, this, that maybe understanding some of these information sources and what information sources landowners are using, and if some regions are seeking information more than others, maybe could help inform some of the extension and outreach efforts. And Riva, I know you talked about it a little bit. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts related to that.
We definitely have the capacity to look into that in much more depth than I presented here. I mean, we do see that there are differences in just general rates of information seeking, specifically for wildfire across those different regions. But we can absolutely break it down and look at it by the specific types of information sources. And so we absolutely have that information to look at more closely.
Awesome, thanks. Paige, I'm going to toss it back to you to do some wrap-up thoughts, and then just plugging that if folks are able to do the poll at the end, that's always helpful for us and for the consortium as well.
Yeah, well, I don't have too many other things to add, just besides how grateful we are that we've had such great organizations to cooperate with and to get advice from, as we've been, getting this study to where it is. And we're really looking forward to the next year of analysis. As academics, of course, we're going to be writing some research papers and investigating kind of some theoretical and methodological kind of issues. But along the way, we very much want to make sure this research ends up being useful for people and relevant for people. And so as much as we can, detect interest and opportunity, we're going to be responsive to working with, organizations, practitioners, family forest owners, to turn it into a format that's useful. So thank you very much for participating today and communicating with us going forward.
Thanks everyone for your questions and your comments. And it's exciting to be able to have them all captured in this Jamboard thing that I've not used before, but it'll be easier to look back at them and make sure that we keep them in the forefront of our minds going forward.
And this will stay open if people have comments after this as well. Autumn, handing it over to you. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today. as everyone mentioned, feel free to reach out to any of us if you want to stay in touch on ongoing results. You can email any of us and we'll get your name to the right list to continue doing that. And again, once you sign off, you'll automatically be directed to an online poll. Please take that. There's also opportunity there to put your email address to stay in touch. And yeah, as I mentioned, this Jamboard will stay open. If you have any thoughts that come up after, feel free to add them here. It's really useful for us to have this captured going forward. And any other feedback, observations, we're happy to hear them. And we just thank you all for taking the hour out of your day today to join us here. Bye, everybody.